What is up, everybody? I didn't forget about you. I promise. I promise I didn't forget about you. I promise, I promise, I promise. I'm probably not going to make a fool of myself in this one because this one was just straight up lecture and I can edit it. So this was cold water immersion. This was the actual lecture that I was going to present in class. And we were hopefully going to have somebody being dunked in ice water to show some of the responses that we'll talk about, or that I'll talk about in the lecture, but we weren't able to. So unfortunately, we wouldn't be able to do that. Now you can try it and you can experience it yourself if you haven't already sometime in your life. Have you ever fallen in really cold water or jumped in a pool that was really, really cold? But there are videos online to show this. In fact, there's one video that I'll link below, and there's also a video in the PowerPoint that you can look at as well. And it shows the responses to cold water immersion. In fact, they had pieces of equipment hooked up to the individual and showed the actual responses, actual real data to this. So that's pretty much the intro for this. Not really much else to say. I'm going to try to keep it professional for these videos. No, I'm just joking. You guys know me. I hope you like it. I hope you like the lecture. Cold water immersion, kind of an interesting topic to get into. And I will see you right after the lecture. All right, cold water immersion. So I want to show a series of pictures, and these pictures were taken by myself while I was in grad school, and they're showing some of the devices, some of the equipment that we were using for environmental research. So one piece of equipment here was an underwater, or a dunk tank, essentially. You could use it for an underwater weighing device, but we actually had one over here in this other room. You can see the blue steps there, and that was actually an underwater weighing tank. That was more for body composition. This device, we normally filled it up with cold water, and the water could range anywhere from very low Celsius up to just, I guess, lukewarm or room temperature water. And I'll get into a little bit of a study that a grad student had performed in this. And then over here, we had a computer which was hooked up to thermistors, and these thermistors were placed on the skin, or that could be rectal thermometers. And the same thing over here. And you can see the PVC pipe coming through the room. This other room on the other side right here is actually an environmental chamber, which was cold air. Now these devices are the thermistors. This little portion here, and the same thing down here, these two are exactly the same types of devices. They just have a slightly different connection. This little piece right here and that one right there would go up against the skin, and normally you'd tape it to the skin, or have some type of way to keep it on the skin, even if it was just pressed on the skin. Or you could even put this in water and determine the temperature of the water. So it's just a thermometer essentially, but most often it's just used in environmental research to place on the skin to determine skin temperature. Now over on the right are different devices to actually use these thermistors, and plugging them into the connectors here. And also down here, this one's more of like a TS type of cable, almost like an audio cable, and this one's a little bit different. But they do exactly the same thing. This one gives you a monitor to read out each individual thermistor. This one up here is actually connected to the computer, and then you can record live data. Now looking into the environmental air chamber, so we could crank this bad boy up to nearly 100 degrees, and we could bring it down to almost zero. I mean, it was really cold in there in some days, in a lot of the studies that we were actually performing. So it's, we could actually look at it as somewhat of a modified meat locker. And we had chairs in there for the subjects to sit down in, as well as different tables and chairs and everything that we could put in there, to where they could be performing certain tests while they're still in the cold environment. So one of the tests that was actually performed, and one of the studies performed by one of the graduate students, was looking at body composition versus cold water. What this individual did was they took 6 low-fat individuals, so about 10% body fat, versus high-fat individuals, and they were approximately 30% body fat. Somewhere right around 28% was the average. So the subjects came to the lab on 3 different occasions. And when they would get into the tank, it was one of 3 temperatures, either 18 degrees, 22 degrees, or 26 degrees Celsius. There was a baseline measurement of all the data. It was core temperature, skin temperature, heart rate, blood pressure. There was also some blood analysis there as well with hormones, mostly epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are referred to as the catecholamines. After that, there was a 2-hour immersion in the water and then 15 minutes of active recovery following the 2 hours of immersion. And the active recovery means that they were actually doing something. They weren't just taken out of the water and standing there and waiting for their bodies to warm up. They were put on a bike, a stationary bike, and cycling for about 15 minutes. It was just a light workout, but it was still enough to get the blood flowing and get the body warmed up actively versus just sitting there in room temperature. Now, one of the major findings from this study was the low-fat individuals had a lower core temperature, so they were not able to protect their bodies as much because they had basically more fat, more subcutaneous fat underneath the skin. So there was an insulative property there. But also there was an increase in what we refer to as the volume of oxygen consumption, or VO2, throughout the entire range of the time that they were in the water. This is showing that those individuals had a much more difficult time and were putting much more effort into just sitting there. And part of sitting there was they started to shiver more and more than the people who had a higher fat content. So in summary, individuals with a higher fat content can protect themselves during cold environments. Although for long-term health, it might not necessarily be the most beneficial, but it's still beneficial, at least in that type of circumstance. Okay, I want you to think back at the beginning of the semester. There was a video that I showed, and I'll put the link below to that video, where the individual was dunked in a tank, and that tank was actually cold water. And they were starting to measure what the VO2 was, heart rate, and they couldn't necessarily take blood pressure, but they were able to get heart rate and look at the breathing rate as well. And if you've ever experienced this, dunking yourself, jumping into a cold pool or a river or a creek or creek, as the rest of the country calls it outside of Western Pennsylvania, then you're going to notice some things happen to you. It's going to be what's known as a cold shock. So this is normally an acute exposure. Hopefully it's an acute exposure, and we'll get into some of the problems that can occur if it's prolonged. So there's a rapid increase in heart rate. So anybody who has any type of heart conditions could actually suffer some type of cardiac event from this. So like a heart attack. There's also a hyperventilation response, meaning that there is more breathing and more exhalation of carbon dioxide. So this is somewhat counterintuitive to water immersion. Normally, once we get in water, and especially if we are going underneath the water, we're trying to hold our breath. So it's very difficult to kind of grasp and to understand what's happening. And that can also cause some confusion, which we'll get into here in a second. The skin temperature is the major stimulus to why this shock occurs. The body is responding, saying, what is happening? This isn't correct. The skin temperature is getting way too low, and the body's responding like a protective mechanism. Now, there's a psychological response to this, which we'll get into in a second. There's what's known as a sympathetic nervous system response, or neurological response. So that fight or flight, but also there's norepinephrine and hormonal responses to this. So an increase in adrenaline. So again, if you've ever experienced this, getting into a cold body of water really quickly, immediately, there's this cold shock. It almost takes your breath away, and you can feel your heart rate increasing. And you can also feel that the skin temperature is very, very cold as well. Let's look at the timeline for self-rescue. There's an increase in the psychological stress, like I mentioned before. That cold shock response is going to cause some panic, and the decision-making skills aren't going to be at their highest. And there's some incoordination that's actually occurring as well. So you might not be able to physically swim efficiently, and the decision-making skills aren't there either. The best advice in this case, if you are, say, a boat is capsized or you fall through ice, sometimes the best thing to do is to just allow the cold shock to subside. And once it subsides, the heart rate will start to go down a little bit, and the psychological stress will start to be relieved as well. From this, you're going to be able to make better decisions about what to do. Now, keep in mind that there's going to be some muscle fatigue associated with swimming or staying afloat. So there's motor function that is impaired, so difficulty moving the muscles themselves, which leads to swimming failure, not being able to continue and stay above the water, which can then lead to drowning. So looking more into this muscle failure in the cold, and we're really looking at the cold water in this case, but this also happens in cold air environments as well. So the blood flow, or BF, is redistributed. The warm blood is going to stay in the core, and the cold blood is going to be going out to the extremities. So there's a vasoconstriction, or the blood vessels are going to be constricting to the extremities in this case, where a lot of the skeletal muscles that you voluntarily contract, and especially need to swim, are going to start to be more difficult to actually get moving. So there's more muscle stiffness, and therefore there's a somewhat of a neurological impairment as well with that. So not being able to actually get those muscles working efficiently. In fact, looking at some skin fold measurements, you can actually start to correlate them to swimming distance in the cold. And again, fat mass can be beneficial for this type of event. I don't want to say event like it's a good thing, like it's a competition, but it is an event that could happen in your life at some point. And being able to actually swim longer distances, the aerobic capacity, the ability to go longer without fatiguing, that's going to be important in this as well. In the video down here, the Mike Tipton video, that is the video that I was referring to earlier. So knowing all of these issues that could arise by suddenly being immersed in very cold water, the dilemma is stay or swim. What do you do? It could be difficult to actually swim because you're really cold. And there's also an increase in convective heat loss. And with swimming, there's an increased flow of cold water that's going over the skin. It's constantly going over the skin and constantly transferring that heat to the surrounding water. So you're continuously losing heat as you swim, more so than if it was just air. And there's also going to be, again, that decrease in the muscle blood flow. So it's going to be somewhat difficult to keep swimming for very long periods of time. So when we dive a little bit deeper into this stay or swim scenario, the research has shown that you have approximately 45 minutes in 10-degree C water, 10 degrees Celsius water, following this cold shock response. Now the decision-making skills start to diminish even more past 3 minutes. You need to wait for the initial cold shock to subside and then make a decision, make a calculated decision. Within those first 3 minutes, it's not going to be that good of a decision, likely. But if you wait too long, you're going to get much, much colder potentially. And the decision-making skills are also going to be diminished just from the exposure, the lengthy exposure to the cold. So there's a narrow time frame there where the decision needs to be made. No less than 2 to 3 minutes, and probably no more than 4 or 5 minutes. So there's a certain period of time there where somebody has to decide whether they're going to stay and try to keep themselves warm and not get much colder, or they're going to swim to the shore or a boat or somewhere. Now, when we look at hypothermia in this case, it's not necessarily looking at the whole body. We're really looking at arm cooling and muscle fatigue, and that's going to be the major factor here, because that could cause the individual to lose the ability to swim to get to safety, and then they're not going to be able to keep themselves up above the water, and they could end up drowning. So this is the immersion in 10 degrees C water, or approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit, with a flotation device. So you have this recovery from the cold shock within 3 minutes. So then after that, you're trying to locate the source of safety. Is it land, the shore? Is it some type of capsized boat? Is it another boat that you might see? And then from that, making an assessment of the chances of being rescued by somebody else coming by in a boat, potentially a helicopter, whatever it may be. If that chance is good, then await the rescue. If it's a poor chance that you might be rescued soon, assess the distance that you need to travel or swim. If it is greater than 45 minutes, adopt help. And we'll get into this here in a little bit of some things you can do to keep warm while you're waiting. If it is less than 45 minutes, then you can self-rescue in that case. You should be able to swim that distance, most likely. Most individuals should be able to go 45 minutes. But there's a video, and I'll post it below, showing even somebody who is really well trained can't go more than 45 minutes or much more than 45 minutes. So even elitely trained individuals can't go much over 45 minutes in this cold environment. So trying to stage off this hypothermia that is likely going to occur through prolonged exposure in the cold water, getting into a near fetal position, having some type of life jacket on, that's going to help to conserve some of that heat closer to the core. And this all helps to lessen the surface area that's exposed to the water. So less convective heat loss. Now the core temperature tends to drop much slower compared to open posture of just basically being a pencil bobbing in the water. Now there's a difference here with the calm versus choppy waters. If it's a choppy body of water, that water is going to consistently start to change over and cause more and more convective heat loss because more cold water is going to be exposed to the skin in that case. If it's a group of individuals, they could group huddle. This limits water circulation over the skin, also provides some psychological support and positive reinforcements to the individuals. We're going to stay alive. We're going to make this. And then other people can start to make decisions as well. They can all start to agree what they need to do to stay alive. Now, if somebody is rescued during this scenario, there could be a possibility of what's known as post-rescue collapse. And this is caused by what is known as afterdrop, where the core temperature decreases rapidly during the rewarming process of the body. So there's an increase in core temperature drop compared to just the cold exposure itself, roughly 1 to 2 degrees Celsius drop in core temperature. Now, the reason this occurs is because that warm blood that was in the core is now being transmitted and pumped out to the peripheral muscles in the extremities. And the cold blood that was in the extremities is now being pumped to the core. So the core now drops. So is it a major source of concern? Yeah, it is. It is something to be aware of. But again, rewarming processes are going to occur like this, and there is going to be somewhat of an afterdrop, and taking the right precautions are going to help to alleviate any problems that could occur, maybe further hypothermia afterward. So looking at the hemodynamics or the processes by which the blood vessels are reacting to this scenario. So there's a peripheral vasodilation opening up the blood vessels to the periphery. And there's also pooled blood that's circulating back to the core. And that pooled blood was the cold blood that I was talking about. That blood that kind of stays in the hands and the fingers, the toes, and the feet is now being pumped back to the core. So an active rewarming in a warm bath or air, that's going to help to alleviate some of this afterdrop, or most of the afterdrop that could potentially occur. So that's going back to that study. That's the major reason why the active recovery was performed versus a passive recovery. There could have been an afterdrop afterward. And if they were already close to getting hypothermia, then that could have sent them over the edge and actually give them full-blown hypothermia in that case. So an active recovery is much better than passive recovery. If they're not conscious for whatever reason, then a warm bath or having warm air or something warm over the body, blankets, for instance. So we know what can happen if somebody is dunked in water now, in the cold water. Is there any way to stage this off by having some type of adaptation? Well, yes and no. So when we look at studies that were performed on Eskimos, there was no evidence of whole body adaptation, but there was an adaptation to what's known as cold-induced vasodilation, the CIVD. And this is more for the hands. And we'll also see this in fishermen sometimes, where their hands are constantly in cold water. We don't know the mechanism of, or at least the reason why this happens, but there is an adaptation over time to have this kind of intermittent vasodilation in the hands so that they can keep the hands warm. Now, this doesn't translate to the full body, like was stated above here, so no evidence in the whole body adaptation with the Eskimos. And it doesn't necessarily transmit to the feet either, but it does happen in the hands. And this figure down here was simply showing the higher blood flow in the hands from non-Eskimo versus Eskimo individuals with the hands dipped in a water bath at a certain temperature. Looking at the specifics of the fishermen that I was talking about, they tend to have their hands in cold water quite a bit, and they also experience this cold-induced vasodilation. So there's a blunting of the peripheral constriction, that constriction within the blood vessels of the hands, causing them to open up and accept warm blood, and the cold blood in the hands goes to the core, gets rewarmed, and then comes back. So there's this circulation every once in a while to keep the hands warm and not get them too cold. Now, like I said before, this is only in the hands. The feet are not adapted to this. The skin temperature in the feet still tends to be lower. Another group of individuals to look at are Korean divers, and these were mostly like pearl divers. So the first thing here is BMR is related to the metabolism. This is known as basal metabolic rate. So just the amount of metabolism and energy production throughout the day, just enough to keep you alive. The BMR is actually similar to the non-divers, but during the winter, there was an increase of around 35% more basal metabolic rate than non-divers. So they were able to keep up more energy and thus translated to more heat production during the winter months. So they were able to keep their bodies warmer during cold exposure. So there was a better response of core temperature. Now, one of the strange things was there was a reversal of this adaptation in these individuals when they started using wetsuits. Before, it was essentially just bikinis and shorts. But once they started using wetsuits, which had some type of insulative properties to them, this adaptation tended to go away. Looking at cold, wet injuries, one of the major ones I want to go over is trench foot. And because this has some historical implications, like with World War I, a lot of soldiers were getting trench foot. So this happens with long exposure, 12 hours or more at, a half a degree to maybe 10 degrees Celsius. And this is cold, wet type of an injury. So it's just not the air. So with the air, more likely it's going to be frostbite. If it's really cold water or it's a lot of moisture, it's likely going to be trench foot. And with trench foot, there's a severe nerve and blood vessel damage. There's no crystallization like there is maybe with frostbite. There are 3 different phases to this. Phase 1, there's some cold, swelling, numbness, and there's no pulse that's now occurring. So the blood flow is being decreased to that part of the body. There's some blisters that are occurring, ulcers, intense pain, and also the area starts to become infected as well. Because keep in mind, this isn't just cold air where the tissues are simply dying. This also has some water involved with it, which can cause some of the bacteria to grow. And then phase 3, there's a loss of sensation. And with that loss of sensation, you're more susceptible to cold injuries because you can't feel it. You can't feel that pain anymore. Even though pain is a bad thing and it hurts, obviously, that's what pain is, it's still a positive in that your body is telling you that something is not right and you need to do something about it. But if you have no sensation, no pain sensation, and you don't know that something is wrong, then you could expose yourself to more injuries. So with cold, wet injuries, quality socks and footwear is vitally important. So transferring the moisture from the skin and keeping it away from the skin. One thing to keep in mind is wearing more than one sock can actually sometimes be an hindrance on blood flow because the shoe or the boot can be too tight. So if there's multiple socks being worn, making sure the boot itself is large enough to allow for some room for the foot to breathe, essentially, so that it is not being constricted, almost like a tourniquet. And I actually found this out the hard way, is my feet would constantly get cold, maybe when I was out hunting or wherever I was, and I was wearing like 3 pairs of socks, but I was wearing boots that were fitted for me with 1 pair of socks. There wasn't any room for my feet to breathe, to move around. So the problem with that is the blood flow was being restricted to my feet. My feet were constantly getting cold and I couldn't understand why. I'm wearing 3 pairs of socks. What's going on? I found out, and it took me a long time. It took me until grad school when I started to learn this stuff, is wearing that one pair of socks, a good pair of socks with that size of boot would have been much more beneficial. My feet may still gotten cold, but it wouldn't have been cold to the point where they were starting to hurt. Also, no low cut boots or shoes. Water can also get in there as well. So making sure that they're high enough to where if you're walking in snow or water or anything, the water isn't going to seep down into the boot. Now, cold, dry temperatures. Again, no tight clothing, no restrictive clothing, in dry clothes. With the sleeping bag, this one's somewhat controversial. Most often you'll hear not to wear any clothes while you're in a sleeping bag because that could induce some sweating, which could be a problem if exposed to certain environments, especially if it's cold. However, if your clothes tend to be wet, your body heat can help to dry that out, depending upon what type of clothing it is and also what the sleeping bag material is, allowing some of that water to evaporate. So it might be beneficial to wear some of the clothes. It just depends upon the situation. And mittens do tend to be much more beneficial and better able to keep the hands warm than gloves, fingered gloves themselves. And this is because that surface area has increased when you separate the fingers. If it's in a mitten, you can close the hands and conserve some of that heat, that convective heat loss that's occurring. Also, any type of external heat source, hand warmers, a hand muff with hand warmers in it is going to be much more beneficial than simply just having gloves on. And I want to wrap this chapter up too by looking at alcohol and alcohol's response to cold environments. And if you ever watch Mythbusters, one of the episodes of Mythbusters actually showed that it was a myth that alcohol helped you keep your core temperature up during the cold. Alcohol will cause vasodilation. And on the surface, that actually seems like it would be beneficial. Wow, you have vasodilation, you can have warm blood going to the peripheral muscles and the hands and the toes and whatever else. But it's actually disadvantageous because now the core is losing that warm blood. So if you're just sitting there and you have blood constantly flowing and it's not being maintained in the core where it can be warmed up, then the core is going to start to drop. Also, there's a cold and pain perception that is decreased. If you've ever had too much to drink and you've had some type of scrape or scratch or had some type of injury, you may know this all too well. Your pain perception is just not there as it would be if somebody was sober. Also, shivering thermogenesis. And shivering thermogenesis just means you're shivering, and with that, you're creating heat. This is actually suppressed somewhat. Also, your urine production is increased with alcohol, which can cause dehydration, which can cause more and more chance of hypothermia, amongst other things as well. And the big one, your judgment is not there with alcohol, and coordination is not there either. So if somebody is drunk, and then they have a boat that capsizes and they're out in the middle of the water, and then they have cold shock. So you have a couple things that's going on. With the alcohol, your judgment and coordination is gone. And with the cold shock, your judgment and coordination is gone. So now you've exacerbated the problems that have occurred. Even waiting those 3 minutes for the cold shock to subside probably isn't going to help any, because the judgment and the coordination is still not going to be there because the individual is now under the consumption and under the influence of alcohol, which their decision-making skills are not going to be there nearly as well as if they were sober. So again, bad scenario all around. Okay, that was cold water immersion. I will see you in 1 second. Or maybe you're going to see me. I don't know if I'm going to see you, but at least you're going to see me. So how'd you like that chapter? It doesn't matter what you think. I'm having these like WWE references lately. Oh my goodness, I'm terrible. All right, cold water immersion. Tell me what you thought of it. I hope you liked it. Again, a very interesting topic to talk about. Some of the responses that occur, especially when we get dunked straight into cold water. We're not acclimated to it at all. In fact, it takes at least a few minutes to get someone acclimated psychologically to it. We have that cold shock that not only it takes our breath away, but other things happen. Psychologically and mentally, we can't make good decisions. Our body is literally in shock. So we can't make good decisions, especially something that might save our life. So waiting a little bit of time to let that subside and then making a decision whether to stay or swim huddle up in a group, whatever needs to happen, and you have to weigh all of those things out if you're stuck in a situation like that. Now, if you're really close to shore, get to shore as quickly as possible, get dried out, get warmed up. But if you know you're a mile, 2 miles off of shore, that's the scenario that we're really talking about here, whether to stay or swim. So we've seen some responses from the hormonal standpoint, epinephrine, norepinephrine, the catecholamines, and also the physiological responses, and what is after drop and how is that problematic in certain circumstances. And we get into how different groups of people like Eskimos or Korean pearl divers, how they maybe adapted, or fishermen too, how they have adapted somewhat to the cold exposure, the cold wet exposure. Again, there's not necessarily a acclimation or acclimatization that occurs quickly, like maybe is seen in hot environments, at least to the human body, but maybe over time, long periods of time, maybe generations, it could get, I don't know, it could get built into the DNA potentially. We're not really sure about that. But we do have some things like cold-induced vasodilation of the hands themselves, especially in the fishermen, maybe in Eskimos, and maybe better able to keep the body a little bit warmer during the cold exposure, like in the pearl divers as well. So there are some adaptations that could occur, but don't expect them to happen really quickly. It's going to take a long time for those to occur. But also keep in mind that the Korean divers, once they started wearing wetsuits, all those adaptations tended to go away after that then. So, and then we started to go into some of the wet injuries, the cold wet injuries. In fact, the biggest one is the trench foot one. Kind of a ugly looking photo there, but it is something that really did occur. In fact, that's where the name came from. The trench foot came from World War I. In the trenches, a lot of the soldiers were getting this trench foot. And to sum up the chapter, we had that misconception that alcohol can help to keep the body warm. I'm not sure exactly where that came from. Well, actually where it came from is people think that it keeps you warmer because you're not actually feeling the effects of being cold, but it is not helping at all. So don't get drunk during cold exposure. Not a good time. Not going to have a good time, okay? Hope you liked the chapter. If you have any comments, have any questions, anything like that, email me or leave it down below. I don't know, whatever you want to do. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to me ramble for however long it was, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it is. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks. I'm like Johnny Cash in this video. Look at this, man. I'm like totally the Man in Black. Holy crap.